All right, let's turn now. Let's open up the scriptures. We have a couple we're going to look at this morning. First of all, why don't we knock out our proverb first, and then we'll turn over to the text there in Mark chapter 10. So let's first just quickly read Proverbs 22:6. Train a child in the way he or she should go, and when he or she is old, they will not turn from it. That's Proverbs 22:6. And now, over in Mark 10, verse 13. People were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." And he took the children in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We are in the last part of the current series that we're on, that we've been on since the beginning of the year. And this one we're calling Training the Hearts of Our Children. Now this could be a really long separate sermon series talking about how do we raise and train our kids in this day and time. This could go all year, and I'm going to try to just touch on it in one sermon this morning. So with that caveat, just keep that in mind. We'll have more discussion, I'm sure, this year in this particular area. But to kind of begin our time, y'all might be familiar with the phrase, "It's just like riding a bicycle," right? It's just like riding a bike. You learn it as a kid, you ride it. If you've been off it for a long time, you can hop right back on and ride it really well. And we say that phrase to describe the experience of something being easy to learn and something that's really hard to forget, right? As we've said in previous messages, riding a bike is one of those kind of automatic muscle memory kind of habit processes that once we learn it, we have it, and then we don't think about it, right? I don't know when the last time some of y'all got on a bike was. Maybe it's been a few years, but you don't sit there and think, all right, now push the pedal this way and that way, turn the handlebars. You just get on and go, right? Well, keep that in mind, because there is a man named Destin Sandlin, and he has the video that you can actually go online and watch, and we'll put it out on our newsletter this week and our social media. But it's called The Backwards Bicycle. Mr. Sandlin here is an engineer, and he actually created a bicycle that operates in reverse. So when you turn the handle to the right, it goes left, and when you go to the left, it goes right. Now, let's ask a question here. How long do you think it took him to learn how to ride that bike? I'll go ahead and tell you. It took him 8 months to learn how to ride that bike, and many, many skinned knees later, okay? It took him that long. It turns out it's not just it's easy as riding a bike is something that is not necessarily the case all the time. It took him 8 months. And he said he would practice. Now, he'd only practice maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes a day. He didn't spend a lot of time on it. But that's what it took. It took him 8 months. And he said that as he was learning to do it, as he was trying to ride, he had to keep constant attention. That if he got a phone call or if he saw a bird that caught his eye or something like that, he would immediately lose concentration and fall. Okay, so it took him 8 months. Now his son, who at the time was 6 years old and had been riding a bike for about 3 years already, how long do you think it took his son to learn how to ride it? What? A month, 2 days? It took his son 2 weeks. That's it. 2 weeks to learn how to ride the bike. Why is that? Is that just how they are? Well, as we've learned through the beauty of brain science and so many other wonderful things, the way that God has designed our development as humans, kids naturally have what scientists call more neural plasticity, which allows them to learn new things quickly because those ways of thinking and doing and those neural connections that we form in our brains, with kids, they're much more moldable and they're easily, you can make those connections a lot quicker. It's why, for instance, if anyone's tried to learn a new language like I'm trying to do, kids can pick up on it like this, and I'm over here struggling. I'm like 3 years in, and I'm like, can talk in a few sentences at best, right? Like kids naturally, God has designed it so that kids pick up on those things. And it turns out, scientists also, by the way, for those of us that are a little bit beyond our kid years, scientists have actually found that they used to think that we lost all of that ability as we aged, that there was no more neuroplasticity. Good news, however, they have since reversed that original diagnosis, and we can learn. It just takes a long, long time. Old dogs can learn new tricks. It just might take you a while. That's what I'm saying. But the point I bring this up, and I think the point of this video for me as I watched it this past week, was I thought about how critical it is that we train our kids in the way of faith, in the way that they'll go, right? Because if those early years are critical for learning and developing in all areas of life, but in particular when it comes to our faith. Kids' hearts and minds are especially moldable in ways that our older people's minds are not as moldable. So it's a critical time, but it's critical not just to train a child when she's young because of human development's sake, but also for the future of our faith. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Y'all have seen these statistics, I'm sure. But according to Barna, a leading study and research group here in our country, in the year 2000, which was a glorious year of coming of age for me, it was a great year in the year 2000. I won't tell you what grade I was in when that happened. But in the year 2000, 45% of the population described themselves as practicing Christians. Now, you might wonder, what is a practicing Christian? Well, according to the study, it was those who would say that faith is important to them and that they've gone to church in the last month. Now, that bar seems kind of low for me in what a practicing Christian is, but let's just take it at that. That was the criteria, and that was in the year 2000. 20 years later, 2020, pre-pandemic, the study was done in 2019, it came out in March of 2020, that number was 25%. That in just 20 years, it had gone down 20% for those moving out of being practicing Christians into a more nominal Christian. Again, hadn't been in worship in over a month or said that faith is really important, or none at all. If the statistics about childhood development don't alarm us, statistics about our faith and the future of it in our country should. And yet, as you think about those statistics, a more recent poll that came out here just this year said that 75% of teens and younger adults do believe in some sort of component, some sort of spiritual dimension in life, and describe themselves hungry to know more. And what that says to me is that there's this amazing hunger that's out there by the vast majority of kids and teenagers and younger adults, but they're no longer seeking and finding those answers in the church or in our faith. In other words, there is a gap between the spiritual hunger that is present and the connected, committed life of following Jesus. We have to be aware of this as people, and those of us that are in generations ahead of them, to ask ourselves, what will this mean for the future generations? On one hand, they might bother us, right? Many of us might say, well, we recognize, well, this isn't the nation or the country or the place that I grew up in, right? It's changed a whole lot. And it might make us to want to retreat away from public life out of fear. We should get away from the world out there because it's no longer sharing our beliefs. But as I think about that, I also think about how we have been given not a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and self-discipline. And that additionally, while we might want to blame younger generations for falling away, what those studies say more to me actually is that perhaps we should look not with them, but with those who are discipling them and look at what we need to do to see about the future of our faith. And I'm looking at myself especially. The question I want to put for us today is, how do we train the hearts of our children and pass on our faith? And again, this could be a multi-week sermon series. But this morning I just want to touch on a few things that keep with our overall sermon series design, especially that idea that information alone is not enough to equal transformation. We need more than just having information in our heads. More is needed for transformation. But we also need healthy practices and habits that cultivate our hearts. Now, one quick grain of salt before I go further. Y'all know this about me. I'm not a parent. So I'm going to talk about children and raising kids and things that way. But the huge grain of salt is that I do this out of theory, whereas many of you do this out of actual practice. Now, I have spent many years being a kid, of course, but also as a youth pastor, a longtime pastor of teens, and someone that just genuinely cares. So I do hope parents, after I get done today, you might come to me and say, "Oof, you've got a lot to work on," or you might say, "That was good, build on it." So I am open to that. So let's first begin. Let's look at our Mark 10 text this morning. And as we look at it, for many of us, this passage is familiar, right? You've heard this many times in church, and it speaks to that beautiful reality that Jesus truly does value children, especially despite his disciples' attempts to shoo them away, to limit access to Jesus. Jesus says, bring them on, right? But what I want to point out to you guys this morning first is not actually the specifics of these verses. It's the overall placement of this story compared to the story before it, right? We remember that chapters, verses, subheadings, all of those things were added in later to the Bible. They were not part of the original manuscripts. And so sometimes they're very helpful tools to allow us to have reference and things like that, but sometimes they prevent us, or they make us want to read in very segmented chunks. But originally the Bible was written as one big story there, those books and those letters. And in the passage before this one, in both Matthew and Mark's gospel accounts, Jesus is approached by the Pharisees who come to him, and they want to ask him about what is lawful and proper for getting a divorce. In other words, their concern is, how do we dress up the question? How do we get out of this? Right? This is not working. This marriage is not working. What's the best way that I can get out of it that God will honor? Jesus, however, in that passage before, he reframes their question to him, not in terms of what makes divorce lawful and appropriate and good and right, but he goes back to what the original intention and purpose of marriage is. He says, Moses permitted divorce because your hearts were hard, and it was a way to manage that. He said, but God's always intended purposes for spouses is to be and to remain and to cultivate that oneness that comes with marriage. And in Jesus' response, he urges them to not think about the situation in terms of how to divorce well, but how to fulfill and thrive in God's original design for marriage. And I say all that to say, I don't think it's a coincidence that before we talk about kids, there's a passage that talks about marriage and talks about family before there. The implication for the training our hearts for our children is that it begins in our marriage relationships, right? Parents, you all set the tone of your household, and you set the tone and the example when it comes to the faith of your kids. No one will have a greater influence on the faith of your children than our parents. That's just period, the end, that's the statement. No one will have a greater influence on the effect of and the faith of your kids than you as parents. And for those of us that are married in those relationships that have children, remember that your priority is your spouse first and then your kids, and not the other way around. Kids need to see and to be a part of a healthy marriage before they need healthy parents. Because generally those two things, there's a relationship there, right? And this is important because for any of us that have been mortified when your toddler said some word that you didn't know they knew out in public, right, and embarrassed you real bad, as we know, just like our phones, kids are always watching and listening and picking up on things, even when you don't think that they are, right? And so that's why it's so important. One of the many reasons why it's so important to make sure that our marriages are healthy, because kids pick up on that. Those plastic brains we talked about earlier, they just soak all of those things in. And so many times we substitute a healthy marriage for trying to be a healthy parent outside of that. And those don't belong separate, they go together. One of the dynamics that we have seen in many families that can happen so often is when a spouse's emotional needs aren't being met by the other spouse. So many times that person then turns to their children as a way of meeting their emotional needs that their spouse isn't giving them. If they don't feel heard or supported or validated or even loved, children can then become the balm that soothes the pain of that parent or spouse relationship. The child, therefore, then becomes a confidant or an expected or demanded source of affection rather than the spouse, and they can become smothered. This is very damaging to children. We have to remember to keep our spouses first, those that have children in that marriage relationship. It's also why date night is so important, right? It's why taking those times to actually spend with your significant other is important. It's why taking that time after a long day and the kids are in bed to just honor your spouse by taking those moments to listen as you talk about your days are vital. They're not just nice things to do. Those are the practices that allow us to maintain and live in that healthy relationship. It's why you honor your spouse or your significant other saying, hey, I will watch the kids right now. You go out for a run or you go out and do what you need to do. Let me give you that little time away. Remember, we set the tone. Parents, you set the tone as parents. And you do that by setting the tone as a spouse first. And notice in that passage in Mark, it says that people brought their children to Jesus. In other words, kids didn't just wander up to Jesus, right? They didn't just find their way to him. It says, no, that people brought the kids to them. No, in other words, there was an intentional effort made to expose their children to Jesus. And remember, this exposure doesn't just mean dropping them off at a youth ministry or even at your Christian school or at a Sunday school. That doesn't count. Those are inadequate practices to create the long-lasting training that is needed at home. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10, Paul writes to Timothy, and even though he's more of a mentor figure, he writes these words that I think are really important for all of us. He says this. He says, now you have observed my teaching, my conduct, my aim in life, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions, and my suffering. And he goes on to say, and yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. Remember, when it comes to teaching, there's both an explicit teaching that happens when you actually talk to your children and tell them specific things, but there's also an implicit teaching that happens all the time. All the time. Remember, a couple weeks ago, I said that we learn through imitation. Paul here reminds Timothy of both the explicit teaching that he observed, but also he says, Timothy, remember, you saw my conduct with you. You saw my aim and my purpose in life. You saw my faith, the way we prayed together and studied Scripture together, and my trust of God. He says, you saw my character, how I treated you with patience and love and steadfastness. You saw my struggles and everything I went through. And he says, you saw how the Lord rescued me from all of it. When we substitute training our kids at home for dropping them off at a program at church or at school, you miss out on all of those things. You only get a small sliver of what kids really need to see from parents. I don't have any facts or figures to back this up. This is just my experience for 10 years as a youth pastor. I noticed a very clear divide between students whose parents practiced and modeled their faith to them and those that didn't. Very clear, very evident. That's not to say that there wasn't some great stories of a kid who came and their parent wasn't a Christian. That's not to say that there were some kids that had a lot of issues when their kids did have strong practicing Christians. There are exceptions to that. But by and large, that was my experience, that your faith and your example at home matters. And as I told a parent this week, you do not have to be a perfect parent. You don't have to have it all together. Praise God, right? Because none of us would qualify. And in fact, some of the most important things that you can do as a parent is to say, I don't have it all together, but I want to learn and I want to improve, and I need to admit when I don't have it all right and get help. Kids need to see that because it shows them that they don't have to hide from that or run from that, but that's how you model improving and getting help. That is important. And so parents, the question then becomes, if you set the tone for your families, what might this look like in your homes? What might this look like to practice our framework that kids and us need more than information, but that we need to develop thoughtful habits and practices in our homes that we invite our kids into that really just steep their imagination into the way of Jesus? I just want to give you a few things here before we end. And to do that, I want to talk about tomatoes and technology and testimony, all right? Tomatoes, technology, and testimony. Let's start up with tomatoes, okay? Tomatoes in my family are a little bit sacred, all right? My grandfather on my mom's side, her dad, he proudly wore the nickname Mater Man. If you didn't know we were from the South, when I said that phrase, you would realize it there, right? He wore the nickname the Mater Man because he was a farmer who grew up with a healthy amount of tomatoes among many other vegetables. It's one of those things that as soon as someone cuts a sliced tomato and you smell that smell or you touch the leaves of a tomato plant, I am brought right back to my grandparents' house like that, right? I'm sure y'all have those things in your life. But I bring up my grandparents because that's where the tomatoes were grown, and it was a regular weekly rhythm for my sister and I growing up to spend Sundays. They were for a few very specific things. They were for going to worship. Then they were going to my grandparents' house where we had lunch around the table, usually with a sliced tomato somewhere on the table. And then the afternoon was spent in play and in rest. And then maybe that night we might get in a little homework. I don't know. That was kind of hit or miss for me. But it was for those things. Sunday, it was a very clear rule or expectation growing up that unless I was on death's doorstep, I was to be going to Sunday school, worship, and then my grandparents' house. That's how it was. That was the agenda. And whether I fought about it, whether I complained about it, whether I bellyached about it, that was the law of the land, and that was the expectation that was set in our house. And when I got older, into a working age, my mom would tell me, I want you to get a job. That is so important. But when you get a job, guess what you're not going to be doing on Sundays? You're not going to be working on Sundays because Sundays are for worship, for grandparents' house, for rest, and for play. Joke's on her. Now I work on Sunday every single week, right? But I say all that to say this was a very important, intentional weekly rhythm in our house. She never used that language. I didn't necessarily use that language when I was growing up. But when I look back in that time, I see now, whether Mom intended or not, she was instilling a sense of the sacred into my life, not through explicit teaching, but through the creation of this rhythm that existed throughout our childhood that we still carry even to this day as a part of my life. And as I look back on those early days, despite the fact that my heart wasn't always in the right place, again, I would much rather draw pictures during worship and look up all the battles that David went into. That was my worship practice as a kid. Than often listen. There was something about this weekly ritual that we went through. There was something about this habit that taught to me about some strong priorities in life. The importance of a day of rest or a time where our week needed to look and to feel different. No other day was like Sunday at our house. It was a special thing. Tomatoes also remind me of the dinner table. People have often asked me, how did you get so comfortable praying aloud? And I go back and I tell them, I think I got comfortable praying aloud because my parents, my mom in particular, would model for me. Every night we'd sit at the dinner table, which I know is a luxury for many of us. Not all of us do that. And especially you look at stats that say we don't do this as a culture anymore. But we'd sit at the dinner table, and at first she would model praying. And then for much of my childhood growing up, I and my sister were some of the primary prayers in our house after, for our meals. I look back and I think it was that little thing, that little practice of just making us and encouraging us to pray before a meal that allowed me, when I got older, praying aloud is nothing. It's easy for me because I did it for years and years and years growing up. These are just a few personal examples, but I think that they speak once again to the power of habit and ritual and rhythms that we can form in our homes. Habits that can exist around the table or around work and its place in our lives. Does work dominate our home's life, or is it have its proper place? For me, it dominated Monday through Saturday, but Sunday was sacred for us. They talk about the rhythms of praying together and reading together. And again, rarely was any of this explicitly taught. I'm sure that was part of it. And what kind of angered me at times growing up, now I look back and I appreciate that my parents were willing to fight those battles and to set the priorities. I know as a parent that there are battles that you have to pick and choose, right? There's some things that you say, all right, we'll let it go this time, and others that you have to keep fighting. But there's some battles that are worth fighting, and we have to make sure that we keep on fighting them. I'm curious, for you all, which of you have rhythms and patterns and rituals that you experienced growing up that established the roots of your faith that got you to where you are today? And what are some of the obstacles that we face now in creating those rituals? It's to that end, I want to talk about technology for a moment. Now, one of the biggest differences from the time I was a kid to the time I was a teenager was technology. The expansion of technology and its integration into our daily lives. Because as an elementary school kid, I remember being in the woods and wearing camouflage from like the time I was like 3 to the time I was probably like 7. Like that was all I wore because I was outside the entire time. As a teenager, I have a lot of memories playing video games and learning about some new thing called Facebook or MySpace. I thought it wouldn't really last, right? Yeah, right, okay. Perhaps I'm just a little bit off on all of that, but I feel like today, not just for technology reasons, but other reasons, it feels like it's a lot harder to establish those rhythms and habits and practices. And I wonder if part of the reason is technology. Now, I'm not a Luddite bent on, saying, let's all go out and smash our phones and go back to dial-up internet. When those noises that would make so fun, right? Like, no, I'm not going to say that necessarily, but I do think that in our cultural moment, we all need to regularly re-examine our relationship and our habits and the place of technology in our lives and in our homes, because of its unique ability to disrupt and be all-consuming in our lives. In fact, how many of y'all have checked your phone in this service, right? I know some of you might be on it right now, okay? Like, I know it happens, right? We take it everywhere. It used to be that our phones were connected to the wall, and we had to go there. Now our phones are connected to us, and we go wherever they tell us to go. And where many of the generations older than myself, as well as my generation, to an extent, are not native to life with this level of technology, the younger generations, they're native to it. They grew up in it. It's part of their DNA. This is why it's so important that your grandkids, you love them when they come over and tell you, and you say, can you fix my TV or my computer or my iPad or whatever? Like, praise God for that, right? That's a beautiful thing. But on the other hand, we must be very wise and thoughtful with our tech consumption. After all, many sociologists sounded the alarm on the rise, especially in teen anxiety, depression, and suicide, that correlated pretty strongly, it's not 100% there, pretty strongly with the creation of the iPhone and social media. You can see the charts are pretty astounding of, that upward movement to the right when those things were created. And so it leads me to ask, what should our relationship to technology be like? I'm still working on this myself, both in idea and actual practice, but I just want to give you all a couple thoughts on what could be really, again, a longer series. First of all, I think it's important that we all define and enforce the relationship to technology. That we define and enforce our relationship to technology. So, for example, when I was growing up, I got a phone when I started driving. That was kind of the rule, right? And again, this was back in the day before smartphones. But I got a phone when I was driving so that my parents could reach me. That was when they gave it to me. So they said, "This is the purpose." And praise God for it. I still remember being on Ragsdale Road one night when my alternator went out and having to call my dad at like 11 saying, "Dad, come get me." I was so glad I had that phone and I used it for its purpose. Is that the purpose for your kids' devices today? Is that the purpose for their phones? Or is it as a cure to boredom? Is it to stay in touch with friends 24/7? Is it to be used alone at night in your bedroom without any sort of filter? Are there limits to the times and places that we play video games or that we have our phones or that we watch YouTube? I can't tell you the many times, this is to produce no guilt for anyone in the room this morning, I can't tell you how many times I would ask kids, "Hey, what'd you do this weekend?" Basically watched 16 hours of YouTube. That was like the weekend. Again, no guilt out there to anybody, but that's what it was. It leads me to ask, what are and what should be the times, the spaces, and the uses of an appropriate amount of technology in our homes? Again, parents, we and you all set the standard for what that looks like. We should all ask ourselves that, whether we have kids or not. Again, the goal isn't to eliminate tech. It's to define and to live in a healthy relationship with it. And the reality is the technology companies, really intentionally, I was almost to say they don't, but it's very intentional that they design much of technology to be addictive. That's part of its design, to sell us products and to do much more. We have to be the ones to say, this is how our technology will be used in our home or not. And secondly, we've got to model it. Again, this goes back to my first point, but I can't tell you how many times I would be in youth group and talk to my students about, "Hey, let's not get on our phones, let's not do all this," and they would tell me, "Well, mom and dad are on their phones all the time," and I'd say, no, that's not. They're older than you. They didn't grow up with technology. That can't be the case. And then I'd go spend time with mom and dad, and guess what? Their kids were telling the truth, right? We are just as bad as the younger generations that we sometimes like to pile on top of. If we want to model a better way to deal with boredom or anything like that, we've got to set the standard. We've got to set the standard. Maybe this means on a Sunday that we all, have to share our screen time statistics. Right? I did that with Dale this morning, right? I said, "Dale, here's my screen time for this past week." And you know what? I was embarrassed by it because it was way too high. What if we all had to do that? We have to think about how will technology be used in our home, and how are we going to set the standard and practice and set the practice for how it will be used. Finally, the last point, and then for the sermon, testimony. We got tomatoes, we got testimony, we got technology, and now we have testimony. Exodus 13, God is giving the Israelites the Passover ritual, and in verse 14, it says, "When in the future your child asks you, 'What does this mean?' you shall answer, 'By the strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery.'" In Joshua chapter 4, Joshua says to the Israelites, "Pass on the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, so that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in a time to come, 'What do these stones mean to you?' then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off in front of the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the Israelites a memorial forever." What is your story that you share with your kids? What are your stones that you hold up in your kids' lives as a sign of a testimony? This is God's story with me. This is where God has brought me in my life. What are the ways in which you celebrate those markers in your life? What if you had a baptism a baptism remembrance day, and you told your kids the story of your own coming to faith. Does anyone remember the day they were baptized? Maybe you could look it up and celebrate that day. What if you brought the Advent wreath and its candles that we celebrate here in worship, brought that into your home, and you had your own little Advent wreath, and each week on a Sunday after church, you'd light it at your home and talk about love, joy, peace, patience, and maybe how you want to work towards those things. What if, when Lent is coming up here in a few weeks, you chose a family way of fasting during that time? Maybe it was with technology. Maybe it's with food or something else, but you did it as a family. What if you went together as a family during the Christmas season and served or gave gifts to those in need here at church or somewhere else? All of these things point back to how are we embracing and cultivating curiosity with our kids. Why do you do what you do? One of the best things I would always receive, not as a parent, but as a pastor with youth for a long time, is questions. Curiosity. Why do you pray so often? Why do you keep coming to my games even though I'm sitting on the bench? I got that one before. What does it mean when we light the candles in worship? What do you mean, what do you think about this person I'm dating? Curiosity, my friends, is a beautiful thing. And we should also never underestimate the power of the phrase, "Tell me more about that." Kids, it's not only beneficial for them to ask us, but if you're a parent, one of the best things you can say to your kids is, "Tell me more about that." When you begin from a place of genuine curiosity about their lives and not from a place of judgment about what's going on in their life, and just ask them to tell you more, it's amazing how much they will speak if we're truly willing to listen with open hearts. Curiosity and testimony are key. My friends, if you are not a parent this morning and you've been kind of surfing on your phone this entire time, waiting for it to get relevant to you, I just want to say one thing. As a part of a recent study that came out, one of the things that was said was this direct quote here. It says, "Having a spiritual mentor is one of the strongest factors for helping young people develop a resilient faith, one that grows and sustains them over time and helps guide them toward meaning and purpose in life." Having a spiritual mentor is one of the strongest factors. This goes beyond a parent, right? This is why we baptize people into a community, not just individually as families or as individuals, but into a community, because we do this together. Parents shouldn't have to deal with the whole burden of being a parent alone. We need to do a better job of reminding them that and helping them that. One of my greatest honors as that pastor was coming alongside parents and saying, "I'm here with you. You don't have to do this alone." We are called to be those spiritual witnesses and mentors for all of our children and all of this community together. Train a child in the right way, and when they're old, they will not stray from it. That, my friends, is not a promise, it's wisdom. Many parents are perhaps hurting this morning because they're waiting for that promise. They're waiting. They said, "Didn't I do everything right? And why is my kid still this way? Why is our relationship still broken? Why is this still going on?" Once again, I want to remind you, this is wisdom, not a promise. And I just want to tell you my story. Growing up, I hated youth group. I didn't go. My parents tried to make me, didn't take. I didn't like it, didn't want to do it, wanted no part of it. Y'all know the rest of the story. I spent the last 10 years in youth group almost every single week. God still found a way. So parents, if you have done all that you know how to do, if you have someone that has poured out your life to your kids like I know all your parents are, and you still find yourself on the other end of that broken relationship or wondering when they might find their way back, do not stop depending and seeking the grace of God. Because it found me one day on a mountain in Puerto Rico, and you never know when it'll find your child. So keep praying, keep seeking, keep modeling, and keep doing what you need to do. And let's do it together so that we can see our children's hearts and faith be trained, and so that they would know the true grace of God. Let's pray.